Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. This is a conversation I did back in 2018. Actually, the interview was in 2017, but it was released in 2018 with John Hamer and Lach MacKay. Lach is a Community of Christ apostle, and this was right before John had been officially ordained to the Council of 70 in the Community of Christ. So we're going to talk about some LDS myths about the Community of Christ and the Kirtland Temple, some of the old myths about that as well. We'll also talk about the Word of Wisdom myths, and the most famous, one of the most famous interviews I had with John and Lach was about the differences between LDS and Community of Christ temple worship. So this was a top 10 hit for a long time, and I thought it would be good to pull it out of the archives. So I hope you enjoy. This has got better sound and a few updated graphics, not too much there. But anyway, super fun interview, one of my most popular interviews with John Hamer and Lach MacKay. So check out this rebroadcast of our 2018 interview. All right, before you do that, I'd like to invite my family in for a special treat. This is Preston, Brandon, and Jessica, PB&J. Now, about in 2011, we got together and started Gospel Tangents. We started with this cute little thing here. Brandon, at the time, he's a lot bigger now, was just 8 years old. I think Jesse was 6, is that right? 5, and Preston was just 3, I think, or something. He was very young. We decided to make the Book of Mormon for kids. We're going to be we've got here the Bible for kids. This is now on sale. It's the first time it's ever been in print, so we're really excited to do this. This is kind of our 1-year anniversary of starting Gospel Tangents. We started almost exactly a year ago. So anyway, my kids said, hey, we should make a print version, not just a Kindle version. We've had the Kindle version out for quite some time. This has been a fun family project. My kids have learned more about the Bible, the Book of Mormon. We've also got the Doctrine and Covenants on Pearl of Great Price. So these are on sale. And so check out our Amazon page at Gospel Tangents. You can do a quick search and you can find these. These go to the mission fund for these fine kids. Do you guys have anything you want to say?
Read it, buy it.
Read it and buy it. All right. Now back to our conversation. Welcome to Gospel Tangents Podcast. This is a star-studded podcast. I'm excited to talk to an apostle in the LDS Church. We don't get to do that, period, I don't think. I do want to talk to Dallin Oaks. He wrote a book on Joseph Smith's martyrdom one time, but I have a feeling he's probably not going to say yes. So could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Lachlan MacKay, member of the Council of 12 and Community of Christ, and I oversee the Northeast field in the U.S., which is Michigan, and basically Kirtland to Maine to Virginia. I have functional assignments, including Community of Christ historic sites. I oversee historic sites and lead the church history and sacred story team.
Okay. Well, that's awesome. So also we have podcast extraordinaire John Hamer. I know you've got a list. I remember seeing that one time. I should have looked it up where you showed all your interviews on the blog.
Yeah. Well, the ones I remembered. Anyway, I tried to put it all together onto a list, but it is whatever. It's a dozen different podcasts, but then 100 episodes or whatever. Yeah. So podcaster.
Yeah.
Why
don't you give us a little bit of an introduction? My sister is new to Mormon history, so she's probably not even heard of you. I think you're a little bit of a minor celebrity. Introduce yourself to those who aren't familiar with you.
Well, I guess in terms of the history work that I do, I primarily have studied the broader Latter-day Saint tradition churches, and so that would be, like I say, all manner of ites, so the Strangites, and especially, but also, Cutlerites and Hedrickites and everybody else. Josephites, our tradition. I'm a member of Community of Christ. I serve as the pastor of the downtown Toronto congregation. I've been called to be a 70, and so I'm a 70 designate, and the ordination will happen in October. I also am a past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association, which is essentially the other ites, or the Community of Christ's version of the Mormon History Association. those kind of things.
Yeah. And you've been interviewed 1,000 times, probably.
100, I think. So,
All right. You also podcast with Infants on Thrones, I believe.
podcast on Infants on Thrones as a regular panelist, and then that's the regular gig. So
One of my favorite blog posts was, gosh, it's probably been a decade now, on the top myths about the community of Christ for Mormons. Do you remember that?
the top 10. Yeah, top 10 myths. Yeah, I don't remember exactly how it was, but our top 10 Mormon myths about the community of Christ or something like that. And that one, we ended up doing there a couple podcasts with that. I think we did one on Mormon expression that was on that same topic. And so, yeah. One of the ones that for the LDS tradition, one of the blog posts that people gets the most traction is, for whatever reason, like sometime in your curriculum every spring, you do the milk and stripping story. And so then suddenly this essay, that's the essay that I've written that has been read more times, is on the milk and stripping story, because every May or something like that, it comes up for some reason. Anyway, in the LDS, I don't know why.
No, that was just a few weeks ago, actually.
Yeah. And so that one, and then the, I can't remember, the other one's the Spalding. So I have one called the Spalding Fable. And so anytime the Spalding story comes up, that one also. So,
Wow.
yeah.
I'm going to try to keep this to about 2 hours, but I could talk to you guys for 2 hours 10 times probably. So at any rate, so yesterday, actually, I guess I should ask, why are you guys here in Salt Lake City?
I was Sunstone. So, I mean, I've been coming to Sunstone for over a decade. I'm, I mentioned JWHA and MHA. In general, I'm just very much in favor of all of these independent community building institutions within the broader Mormon tradition. And so Sunstone's an amazing one of those. And so I enjoyed this conference and came for that.
John here for Sunstone, coming off and on for years. And it's harder and harder to get to academic conferences. And so I was able to get to this one and reconnect with a lot of friends I hadn't seen in a long time.
Now, I know I tried to meet up with you at the Mormon History Association, but we weren't able to hook up. So I'm glad you came out this way. So this was great.
It would have been a shorter trip for me to St. Louis from Nauvoo, but thrilled that we could connect.
Now, are you based out of Nauvoo? Is that where you are?
Yeah, Nauvoo's home. Born and raised in Jackson County, Missouri, 15 years in Kirtland, Ohio, and I've been in Nauvoo since 2007.
Well, great. My current interview, I just posted up this morning, was with Jim Van Cannon, and he's a member of the First Presidency of the Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And when I spoke with you yesterday, you told me that you knew him. Tell how you knew him.
I went to high school with Jim, and my uncle, Fred Larson, is the prophet president of the Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I have had a chance to reconnect with Jim through the years recently.
Oh, wow. So that was a fun interview. So now Fred Larson is the prophet president of the Remnant Church. How is he related to Joseph Smith?
How is Fred Larson related to Joseph Smith? So his mother was Lois Smith Larson. Her father was Frederick Madison Smith. His father was Joseph Smith III, oldest surviving son of Joseph and Emma.
So that's the tie in there. Mm-hmm. So, and I shouldn't ask you about the Remnant Church, but as I understand it, they've gone back to the old RLDS tradition of lineal succession. Do you have any idea? I should have asked Jim this, but do you have any idea who would be the next prophet?
I've not had a chance to talk to Uncle Fred about succession in the remnant, but that would be an interesting conversation. Maybe at Christmas we can talk about that.
All right, I'll have to get you back after that. So great. So one of the things that I love, I know John gave a podcast on Mormon Expression several years ago, I guess it's been now, about the Kirtland Temple. And in talking with Dr. Richard Bennett, my name twin, he had mentioned that your name is spelled, I would say MacKay, but you pronounce it Mackay?
Yeah, Mackay. My father's Australian, and they held on to the Scottish pronunciation. So Mackay, but it's the same clan, Mackay, Mackey, all the same clan.
Oh, really? Okay. So by chance, is that David O. MacKay? Is that a distant relative?
I'm sure that David O. is a distant relative somewhere back there. I had a friend who was kind enough to do some DNA analysis on me, and in his database at the time, my closest living relative was in Utah, and we had a common ancestor somewhere in the last 500 years. So I don't know that it was that close, but
Wow. Okay. Well, that's interesting. So potentially related to a couple different prophets.
probably.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Kirtland Temple. In talking with Dr. Bennett, we talked a little bit about how the temple was constructed. And as we look at the temple today, it's a white building. And I don't know how the construction was, but from what I understand, back when it was first built, it was more granite looking. In fact, I'd heard that they'd actually painted lines and so it sounds to me like it looked a lot more like the Salt Lake Temple today, or it was kind of a faux granite, I guess. Could you talk a little bit about that construction process and what was involved with that?
Sure, yeah. They had hoped to build a bricks. That didn't work out so very well. So they shifted their attention to what they hoped would be a cut stone look. It'd be the nicest building you could put up at the time if you could afford it. And of course, we couldn't. So Artemis Millett, new member, comes down from Canada, brings with him a building technique new to the Kirtland area. The idea is to gather rubble, in this case, sandstone of different sizes and shapes, and using mortar to hold that rubble together, they build a wall about 2 feet thick, about 45 feet high. And then they immediately apply a hard plaster or stucco finish to the outside. They had crushed old crockery and glass and dumped that in, and so that when the sun hit it, it would sparkle brilliantly. And then they painted mortar joints on the wall. So as you suggest, from a distance, it looked like big cut stone block. Up close, you discover stucco and paint. It's white today, described as blue in the 1830s, which I think is really a slate gray. They also had dipped the wooden shingles into a red lead paint to preserve them. And the front doors were olive green. So pretty colorful early on, tragically toned down through the years, but structurally really amazingly intact even today.
Wow. So it's amazing to me that those walls were 2 feet thick. It's kind of interesting to tour the temple. One of the things that's amazing to me, coming from the Latter-day Saint tradition, is that the temple is open to the public, to anyone. In fact, I do remember a few years ago back in the attended the Mormon History Association. We went to the Independence Temple, and I was so excited because, temples are off limits, at least, unless you have a temple recommend, at least for Mormons. So it was really exciting. And I heard someone say, this was kind of a derogatory thing, and I was a little bit offended when he said this. But we were inside the Independence Temple, and he said, "Oh, these people just don't know what to do with temples." And my thought was, temples have changed. Can you talk a little bit about how, and John, if you want to jump in there too, how has the temple changed over the years?
So Kirtland, 1830s, it's a house for public worship with a strong emphasis on empowerment, both spiritually and intellectually. So 2/3 of Kirtland Temple were classroom space. You would worship in the temple on Sundays, and you'd go to school 6 days a week. Kirtland High School met on the 3rd floor. Students ranged in age from 6 through adults. So it was the center of their community life. My sense is that in Nauvoo, the same was going to be true, but you did start to have, I believe, a receipt saying you were a tithe payer in order to gain access to the baptismal font. And they didn't welcome non-members in the temple in Nauvoo while they were performing ordinances, but it was still a public building. So that receipt, I think, is what would many generations later become the idea of a temple recommend.
Oh, that's interesting.
And of course, in Community of Christ, Independence Temple doesn't look anything like Kirtland Temple, but the functions are modeled after Kirtland. So it's a place where we gather to be empowered by the Holy Spirit to go back out into the world, to be the hands and feet of Jesus. John probably has better insight into Independence and the idea growing from 1 to 24. And
Well, no, what I was going to say is that in some ways, because there's this evolving movement from 1830 to 1844, that the restoration tradition, the heritage, is like a grab bag, where you can't do all of it since it's contradictory to, if they were changing things as they were going along. And some of the traditions are trying to do maybe the latest, some of the later things, although nobody is really doing the very last stuff, so there's not very many people that are really worrying about the Council of 50 as and the kingdom of God on earth as their primary thing. So even Brigham Young dials it back 6 months or so, what he's more familiar with. But so this idea of that for the LDS tradition of having what constitutes temple work and everything like that, almost all of this is extremely different from what exists in Kirtland. There's no font, like you say, in the Kirtland Temple at all. That's something that begins in Nauvoo, and the same thing, the endowment ceremony and things like that is taking place after Joseph Smith has been exposed to Freemasonry and things like that. So that also isn't taking place in the whole liturgy and everything like that in Kirtland. But so then I have like a chart, and I'll give it to you so you can splice it in if you want for the videos. But essentially, where you take the spaces that exist, if you take it in Kirtland, like what Locke is telling about, the space for worship, the space for learning, the space for order, the church offices and things like that. You can see where they have that same major portion of the space is devoted to that in Nauvoo, but then there's also the space for the baptism of the dead in the basement, and there's a space for endowments in the attic, and then you go to Salt Lake, all of that's preserved. So there's a big solemn assembly hall and things like that in the Salt Lake Temple. There's the offices for the apostles and things like that. But then when you get to the little temples that are in the LDS tradition, which might be what most Mormons in the Utah tradition are exposed to, they don't have any of those things that are from the Kirtland period. All they have is that kind of basement and attic part of the Nauvoo Temple, and that's their whole experience. And so they go, and that's their temple experience. They go to Kirtland and they say, what did these reorganites do to the temple? It's not even, there's nothing, it's so alien, and that's just that's what Kirtland is. But anyway, so we're each honoring different parts of the heritage.
Yeah. So, and I'm glad you mentioned baptism for the dead, because that's one of the big differences between the Community of Christ and the LDS Church. Is in Kirtland especially, there was no font. Can you talk about the origin? I'll go with you, Locke. Can you talk about the origins of baptism for the dead, especially in Kirtland, because there was no font in Kirtland?
Sure. So I think its origins are in Nauvoo, although with roots in New York with Joseph's brother Alvin. He dies before being baptized into any faith. I think the family is deeply concerned about his eternal well-being. The minister apparently hints at the funeral that Alvin's going to burn eternally because he's not been baptized. So the Smith family was just deeply worried about Alvin for the remainder of their lives. What would become LDS 137 of the Doctrine and Covenants from Kirtland, January 21st of 1836. Alvin is seen by Joseph in the celestial kingdom, and Joseph's so relieved he's okay. He's not quite completely reassured, though. So I think that concern continues to grow in Joseph and finally results in the idea of baptism for the dead by proxy. So Alvin would be okay because we would be baptized in his behalf. In the reorganization, we initially liked the idea, but as Alma Blair, one of our historians, put it, to ignore is to reject. We didn't have a temple to practice in. It could only be practiced in a temple. And eventually, it's not part of us for so long that it just ceases to be part of us.
So, and that's interesting that you mentioned that. I know, and maybe John, you can comment on this. There were some baptisms for the dead in the Mississippi River.
Right. In Nauvoo before they had it. And so I think, though, that was special dispensation, and the idea was at a certain point that they needed to stop and just as a say that they had to get the temple done. And so in some of the traditions that continued. So they had the same thing. So when James Strang gathered people to Voree, Wisconsin, they're building a new temple. They've laid the foundation. They're getting ready to do that. But the saints there are also worried about their relatives and ancestors, people who have died that are close to them. And so they also got from James Strang a special dispensation to do baptisms for the dead. I think it's the White River that's there. So that kind of thing has happened within the tradition.
It also happened in 1840s Kirtland. They performed baptisms for the dead in the East Branch of the Chagrin River. But again, once the commandment to stop until the temple is done came, they stopped.
Oh, I did not know that. That's interesting. So even in Kirtland, they did some baptisms.
Even in Kirtland.
Now let's talk about the important vision. I believe it was April of 1836, the vision of Elijah. I know Elder Bednar in a conference address talked about that as an important vision in relation to redemption for the dead. Other people have talked a little bit about the sealing power for sealing marriages after life, or after this life, occurred there as well. What's kind of the community of Christ's perspective on that vision?
So the perspective on the April 3rd, 1836 vision of the Lord on the breastwork of the pulpit, followed by Moses, Elias, Elijah, probably would really focus on the Christ part. And let me back up a little bit and explain that March 27 of 1836, the temple is dedicated. On the Christian calendar, that's Palm Sunday. And we are shouting Hosanna for the first time as we sing the Spirit of God. I generally think we don't pay much attention to the Christian calendar, but like the larger Christian community, we are shouting Hosanna on Palm Sunday, which means April 3rd of 1836, 1 week later, there's a Sunday afternoon service going on in the temple. There's about 1,000 people present. The curtains or veils are dropped, and veil, like so many terms, you have to know when they're using it before you know what it means. So they're simply room dividers. Veils are dropped around the pulpits. Joseph and Oliver go in, kneel, pray. As they stand, they experience this vision. What that means is that they have a vision of the risen Lord on Easter of 1836. So that, I think, for Community of Christ is what really stands out, is that it's Easter Sunday and they see the risen Lord.
You know, I don't think we'd ever emphasize that it was Easter Sunday. That's interesting. That's very interesting. So one of the interesting things about that vision, and I want to talk a little bit about Fanny Alger. So as I understand it, I interviewed Brian Hales a few months ago. And one of the things that he mentioned was, I guess Don Bradley has made the case that he thinks that sealing between Joseph and his first plural wife, Fanny Alger, or Alger, I guess is how some people say it, may have occurred after that vision. And I guess for me, one of the questions is, Oliver Cowdery was there for that vision, and it doesn't seem like Oliver had any understanding, at least, that this had anything to do with plural marriage. Can you talk a little bit about that, John?
Yeah, well, I guess from my reading of it, I would say that the fact that LDS people later look back to from their perspective of having celestial plural marriage through the Utah period, they look back to that vision and identify that as when the sealing power occurs. But I think that that's an anachronistic reading of the vision at the time. So that they're taking what they understand as a later practice and their understanding of it, and then they're reading back into it this moment of when it would happen. And so I think that rather the idea of the vision is on one hand, like you say, the Easter context of the risen Christ, but then the idea of Elijah and things like that, they've been having this theology of, it's kind of, I think it's like an end times theology where they're really thinking about. And so it's not about plural marriage or sealing power or those kind of things. It's turning the hearts to the children to the fathers and that kind of thing, and it's with the idea of Elijah's coming back because the end of the world. They're very much a millennial sect at the time, and so they're very believe that the literal second coming is going to happen right now, and that's, I think, what they're focused on, not sealing power. So I think that is a misreading of it that happen. And so for Fanny Alger, I think my thinking of it would be unrelated, but we don't have good chronology about when the whole Fanny Alger thing, I think, happens, right? So there's a whole bunch of different time places. And so if you would like to, in my opinion, anachronistically read that vision as being actually relevant to the idea of plural marriage, and then you would like to put Fanny Alger after, then of course you want that to be that way. And I don't think we can date it. And so so for me, it's not a compelling thing to put it before or after, because I don't think it probably is related. Okay.
So as far as Elder Bednar, tying that whole thing back to baptism for the dead, would you all agree that's what that vision was about?
No, yeah, I would say no, that's not about baptism for the dead. And LDS 137, I think, is not about baptism for the dead, although when I was at Kirtland, visitors sometimes would make that connection, but I think that's also anachronistic. I think that what 137 is talking about is preaching in the spirit prison. I don't think Joseph had an understanding that he was going to introduce baptism for the dead at some point.
Wasn't that vision by Joseph F. Smith in 1918, or am I?
That's 138, I think.
Oh, 138, okay.
Yeah. So 137, third floor, Kirtland Temple. Joseph sees Alvin, wonders how it could be there because he was never baptized. He's told he'll be judged by the desires of his heart. God's all-knowing. God knows that he would have accepted had he had a chance to hear it. He'll be okay. So later, I think people say, oh, he's okay because of baptism for the dead. But I don't think that's how they understood it at the time. I think he'll be okay because we can preach to him in the hereafter in the spirit prison.
Luck is amazing that he knows all of the LDS DNC numbers and the community. It's like Celsius and Fahrenheit. I don't know. I mean, ever since I moved to Canada, I now no longer know what temperature it is, because I can't retain my old system and I can't understand the new one. And so I don't know what DNC number it is.
I can only do that if it happened in Kirtland Temple.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, okay.
That's impressive, nonetheless. I talked with Mark Staker. And we talked a little bit about the Kirtland banking crisis. As I recall, there was a very violent scene that occurred in the Kirtland Temple. Could you talk about that and how it relates to the banking crisis?
Sure. So I'm guessing this is the one where Joseph Smith Sr. is in the pulpit up on the west end, and the dissenters are concerned and hoping to probably take possession of the temple. And they storm to the front with guns and knives drawn. Men, this is, I think, Oliver Huntington, one of the Huntington boys said, them that had chicken hearts dove out the windows for safety. The police are called in to restore order. They rush in and they knock over a stovepipe. So I just imagine soot kind of filling the room. And the best part is, after that chaos, they eject the belligerents and resume the services of the day.
Really? Wow.
So I think that's probably the
that might have been quite a service. we don't talk about that in the LDS tradition very often. I remember reading that somewhere and just going, wow.
I think one of them is even they're walking from the front to the back, in some cases over the back of the pews, so stepping from pew box to pew box because the aisles are full of people. So they have to walk on the top of the pew boxes to get up there.
That must have been quite an interesting thing. So, so I'm trying to remember. I believe it was 1838. Correct me if I'm wrong there. That Joseph Smith, things got so bad that he basically left in the middle of the night. What happened to the temple after that time period?
So initially, we leased the temple to the Western Reserve Teachers Seminary and Kirtland Institute. It's a 5-year lease. There's going to be a teachers training school on the 2nd floor, and then a model school for children on the 3rd floor, so a place where the teachers could practice on the kids. They move out after a year, complaining that there are too many steps and that the temple is too hard to heat. By that time, though, the church is growing again in Kirtland. So we'd gone from 131 to 2,000 members there by 38, back to 100 maybe by 39, back to 400 to 500 by 42 and 43. They're worshiping there regularly. But Lyman White comes through and convinces the members to gather to Nauvoo. What had happened is we had purchased all that land in Nauvoo on credit, and the only way that we had to pay for it is to resell it to gathering converts. And so if they're stopping in Kirtland, they're not buying in Nauvoo. And that was becoming a pretty significant financial hardship. So out of that, you have the language that talks about Kirtland will be scourged. We actually we get rid of any stake that is not in Hancock County, Illinois, or Lee County, Iowa, just across the river, to encourage the gathering to Nauvoo. The people in Kirtland make an impassioned plea that they're doing good work, they're caring for the poor, and they get the okay to stay. But they do shrink a little bit again. But they are intentionally waylaying English converts that are passing by on Lake Erie. Empty homes, beautiful temple to worship in. You're going to die if you go to Nauvoo. So that caused some friction, and some of the Kirtland stake leaders are disfellowshipped over that for a time. But they're relatively small again by 44. Joseph's killed. Initially, many are loyal to James Strang, and he is there by, I think, 46, preaches for 8 hours at a stretch. There are at times people they're loyal to William McClellan, at times James Cullen Brewster, at times William Smith. Just a series of small Latter-day Saint tradition churches coming and going. Martin Harris is worshiping with whoever happens to be there. The earliest members of the reorganization are worshiping there by 1860. We got a branch going by about 1874. That one didn't survive. The current branch dates to 1886, and they're still going.
Now, I heard a story, actually from a former Community of Christ member who's actually LDS now, about a sheep shed, that the temple was turned into a sheep shed. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, I've heard that. I don't think so. I think part of that is a misunderstanding of the culture. So you see boxed pews, and they look like sheep pens. But I think also part of that was an attempt to make us all feel better because we had not been able to hold on and preserve the sacred space. I do think that the temple at times, it's really hard to heat. So it's not like there's a congregation meeting there weekly through those years often. But when missionaries would come through, they would sweep it out and preach there. And various Latter-day Saint churches are having conferences there. There was a time, probably in about 1859, I think it's the low point, at times the temple doors would stand open and the local farmers wouldn't pen their livestock. And I think something could wander in and was there until it could wander out. Joseph III described something like that in the 1860s, saying the basement was open and that animals could wander in and out. I think that's the roots of the temple has been intentionally turned into a sheep shed, but I don't think that's what's happening.
Okay. So one of the interesting things to me was to learn about ownership of the temple. Because I understand it's very, very complicated. And can you tell us about
Sure.
the different ownership changes over the years?
Ken Loving did amazing work. He was our stake president in Kirtland. He's now deceased, but was an attorney. And he published an article in the Mormon History Association journal on Kirtland Temple ownership. It's a mess early on. The temple at times is sold in the 1830s by people who don't yet own it.
Was one of them Brigham Young?
No, Brigham's not in the mix.
I mentioned that to Richard Bennett, and he told me that Brigham tried to sell.
Well, that is true. Brigham did try to sell it, but that doesn't mean that he owned it.
Or that he actually successfully sold it.
So there's an advertisement in a Nauvoo newspaper. The 12 are trying to sell the Kirtland and Nauvoo temples. I think it's 46, in the belief that whoever buys them will care for them, maintain them, and that the church could come back later and redeem them. But there are 4 strands of title with the temple. All of them have some problems early on. At times, Joseph owns it personally. At times, he owns it in behalf of the church. When we ran into financial difficulty in Kirtland, he had signed it over to William Marks to protect it from creditors. And then Marks had signed it back to Joseph in his role as church president. So it's with Joseph in behalf of the church at Joseph's staff. To try and kind of forward their claim, though, the 12 asked William Marks to sign a quitclaim deed to the 12, which Marks did. Of course, the problem is he doesn't have anything to convey. He had already conveyed it back to Joseph. There are, again, attempts to strengthen claims. Eventually, the temple is sold for $10,000 to a non-member friend of the church, George Edmonds Jr. He later sells it back for, a few dollars, $150. There's a lawsuit, 1859, Grandison Newell, who had been public enemy number 1 if you're a Latter-day Saint in 1830s Kirtland. He convinced friends in the Ohio State Legislature to pass legislation specifically so that Joseph's properties in Kirtland could be sold to recoup the costs of prosecuting Joseph for the Kirtland Bank case. Winds through the courts in Paynesville, Ohio, Lake County, Ohio. The temple and 13 acres eventually sell for $150. The guy that buys it happens to be Grandison Newell's grandson-in-law. And then the same day, he sells just the temple to Russell Huntley for $150. So Huntley was a Latter-day Saint of some variety. He eventually joins the reorganization and conveys the temple to Joseph Smith III and Mark Forskett for $150. We got really interested, though, not in temple ownership, but in identity questions. And so we had attorneys telling us, if you don't do anything, your somewhat cloudy ownership, because there were problems in all of those change of title, your cloudy ownership will become clear by 1881. So we could have done nothing and had clear ownership through adverse possession. 21 years is the mark in Ohio. You possess, you're proclaimed to the world, it's mine, nobody
You're paying
objects.
taxes.
Yeah. So 21 years would have been 1881. But again, ownership isn't what it was all about for us. It was identity. So we created a lawsuit, the Kirtland Temple suit, to try and prove to the world that we were Joseph Smith Jr.'s church. Unfortunately, our local council didn't show up, and our council, who was not from Ohio, went ahead anyway. And that's the 1880 Kirtland Temple suit. Actually started pretty well for us. We had written the brief, given it to the judge. He just read it back. The reorganized church is the true and lawful successor to and entitled to the property thereof, Joseph Smith Jr.'s church. Woohoo, we said. But then he said, oh, but you filed the case wrong, case dismissed. Oh, and I don't know what happened then. Part of me thinks that the attorney must have been so embarrassed he left that part off.
Oh, really?
But fairly quickly, we are trumpeting to the world the judge's decision without passing on the case dismissed.
Oh, so now let me ask you a question, because Brian Hales, when I was talking to him, he had mentioned that the temple lot, who are known as the Hedrikites, and we do need to get into all these schisms, John.
Yeah.
But they were the ones that had owned it, and then the RLDS church.
Temple law. You're talking about.
I'm talking about the temple lot.
Yes.
In
church.
Independence.
Yes.
But we're talking now about
No, Brian Hales told, because I got confused.
No.
Because Brian Hales said that the temple lot had taken ownership of the Kirtland Temple, and then
No.
then the RLDS church went running out of the courthouse and said, "Woohoo, we won!" And even though they hadn't won, and kicked out the temple lot people.
So it's just a more complicated story. So you're just conflating two temple cases. So there's the Kirtland Temple suit that's first, and then when this became, as far as the RLDS church was concerned, a real PR win, even though it's kind of not really a win. Really. But anyway, it seemed pretty great. And so then that made the leadership, they're like, hey, we could keep this thing going, And so then there was a suit that happens in Independence with the Hedrikites, who do have possession of a portion of the original temple lot. And so then their suit, by the RLDS church with the same idea in mind. And in fact, actually, it does serve the same PR purpose, because there's a bunch of different rulings, and at one of the appeals levels before the whole thing gets dismissed and not in our favor, again, there's a nice ruling that we're the true successor legally, as if the court matters to decide these kind of things. But anyway, and then that gets used. But so you're just conflating the two cases. And
Brian is.
Brian
is.
Because I was familiar with Independence, I wasn't familiar with Kirtland. But what he said was that the RLDS church had cheated the Hedrikites out, and then in Independence, a similar sort of a thing, and the LDS church said, no, we're the true
Hedrikites are only a tiny group at the time, and their whole thing was to go back to Independence. They were never in Kirtland anymore. They're a branch that's from Bloomington, 4 or 5 branches in the Bloomington, Illinois area. They reorganized when Johnny Page, who'd been one of the apostles, who hadn't gone with Brigham Young, reorganizes, and they make Granville Hedrick the new prophet president of their church. Do they make him prophet?
I'm not sure.
I think so. Anyway, and so then he has a revelation, or right before then, or right around then, that they need to go back and redeem Zion. And so they move from, slowly anyway, they move from their branches in Bloomington, Illinois, to Independence, and they go back and purchase themselves, not by going and taking legal claim and saying we're the true church and things like that, and this property belongs to us. It had subsequently become part of the city of Independence plat and been divided into lots and everything like that. So they slowly start purchasing up the lots until they have the portion of the temple lot that they own, and then they owned it, and they were done, and they moved there. But they never, ever since they organized, in there, they never went to Kirtland there. So it's a completely different case.
Okay.
So,
that was my understanding as well.
same RLDS tactic, different group. The first one was just us fighting with ourselves and then winning and deciding that was going to...
So it is true we were fighting with ourselves, but we did name as defendants the church in Utah.
Really?
Not the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because some of the deeds had variations of that name on them. So it was John Taylor and the church in Utah.
Really?
Of course, it was the
cohabitation hunts, so John couldn't.
Yeah, so they didn't respond to that Kirtland suit. So that's why I say we had it with ourselves, although obviously we pretended to invite other people to the party, Whereas what happened with the Temple lot suit then is when we decide we're going to have, round two, when we actually are suing, the poor Hedrickites, that what happens is that then everybody gets named, and the LDS church or the church in Utah or whatever shows up at the party, and so then they are suddenly are a like on the side of then the on the side of the Hedrickites to kind of enemy my enemy is my friend kind of thing, and so they're helping the Hedrickites prove that the Josephites are wrong, and they're doing this kind of thing. And then this interesting thing happens with the Temple lot suit, which is every early Mormon who's still around, they all show up and they testify under oath about all sorts of things, including sexual relations regarding polygamy, which we otherwise wouldn't have, and it becomes this incredible source that you otherwise wouldn't have in the Victorian era. So everybody testifies, and they get on the record, including all kinds of disinterested parties. So like Strangite apostles show up, and they explain their understanding of the history of the of polygamy and things like that. And so they're not even an interested party at all necessarily, but everybody showed up.
So it sounds like the flaw in our strategy was not filing the Temple lot suit early enough, because of the 1890 and the manifesto. If we would,
I don't even know if it was a smart strategy under any circumstance.
I don't think it was, but it had been earlier, then nobody from the West could have shown up.
That's right.
We talked a lot about Hedrickites and Strangites and Josephites and Brighamites. John, this is kind of one of your special areas. I know yesterday in your presentation at Sunstone, you kind of gave a brief overview, and I was looking at your slide. And do you think I could put that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
that'd be awesome. So, looking at your slide, you had 9 people in there who claimed leadership of the church. Can you talk about who those 9 people were?
Well, it was a visual. It should not be meant to be a definitive list or something like that, because some of the people on that list aren't actually claiming. So what the claims are different in each individual case. But essentially what I said was when Joseph Jr. is assassinated, he is also killed along with him is Hiram. So Hiram has this kind of anomalous role of he's in the first presidency, but he's also assistant president of the church or vice president. I mean, he has this extra role in the church. If he hadn't died, I think everybody pretty clearly would have understood that Hiram would have been the successor to Joseph Smith, but he dies as well. And so then there is kind of that leaves the question open precisely who the successor should be. And so one of the last acts that Joseph Smith had before going to Carthage is he gave another one of these special blessings to Joseph III, and there's been several of these where had been prophesied that at one point or other he would be in his father's role and be a prophet, but he was 11? He's 11. So, okay, it wasn't going to be the successor at that point. And so what I argue, I think that the person who had the best claim at that point in terms of both civil and canon, which is to say church rules and law, is Sidney Rigdon, who, even though he's been a little bit on the outs, but he's still actively campaigning as the vice presidential candidate in Joseph Smith's U.S. presidential election. So Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. And so that Sidney Rigdon is the only guy left in the first presidency. And so even though in the LDS tradition, there is this idea that the first presidency dissolves and then the senior most apostle always succeeds, the only reason that is the idea is because they didn't want to have Sidney Rigdon be in charge. It doesn't say that in the Doctrine and Covenants or anything like that. So there's no canon law thing that says anything of the kind. That isn't, and the first presidency had been a completely distinct thing in the early church tradition from the 12.
Nothing that says it dissolves.
And there's nothing that says it dissolves, and it's also not like that the first presidency is just 3 more of the 12 or something like that. It's a completely distinct thing. And so anyway, so what I'd say is that Sidney Rigdon is the last surviving member of the first presidency, and then according to the actual incorporation, so we're talking about like the church's possession. William Marks had signed it back over to Joseph Smith on behalf of the church. The church is incorporated in the state of Illinois, and part of that incorporation in the documents in Carthage, it says, held by Joseph Smith as trustee and trust for the church and my successors in the first presidency. And so because of that, because when Brigham Young does take over, he doesn't create a new first presidency, right? The 12 just take over headquarters. And one of the reasons why he's not able to get title to these temples is because James Strang knows about that, because he's got a lot of these guys in his group who have been central members. They know this incorporation ruling. This is really complicated details, but anyway, part of the idea of it is that he charges that since he is the successor in the first presidency, he's organized a new first presidency. This doesn't happen when Brigham Young's church until 1847, and so he's operating that way with the first presidency. And so he says, you don't have a first presidency. I have title to the Nauvoo temple. You're trying to sell my temple.
James Strang created a first presidency and said that should be the successor?
Yeah, he did that. He did that at that point. But before that, anyway, so I got to dial it back. The person who was in the surviving member of this first presidency then is Sidney Rigdon. So Sidney Rigdon, though, gets outmaneuvered, as we know, in this showdown between Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon, and he takes he gets kicked out of Nauvoo and or flees for his life, and he goes back and reorganizes and creates a new headquarters of the church in Pittsburgh. But at that point, he suffers one of these things that all kinds of schismatic Mormon Latter-day Saint heritage churches do, which is then they start asking themselves, okay, well, where did we go wrong? So obviously something's gone wrong here that we've had to, where we went on the wrong path, where we started doing polygamy, where we changed the name of the church, where we took up arms and marched to Missouri. And so they start to peel back the onion. And this is what happens with Sidney Rigdon's movement. And so they over time, they go back to the earlier name of the church. It's ultimately called the Church of Christ again. And he just keeps purging things back, and he just pisses people off at a certain point, and all the people around him are finding his organization unstable. And so it more or less atomizes within 2 years. And so that was the main potential rival, but it didn't happen. Another rival to Brigham Young then. So Brigham Young is president of the Traveling High Council of 12 Apostles, who are in charge of the church's missionary work. The person who's in charge of the presiding or standing high council of the church in Nauvoo, church headquarters, is William Marks. So they are in some ways heads of the two different councils that are up over the church jurisdictions. So the 12, oversee everything that's going on in a branch where there's no stake. But wherever there are organized stakes, they're not in charge of it. And instead, the stake presidency is in charge of anything that's going on within that stake. And then if you've had a trial or something like that from a local stake presidency, that can appeal then to the headquarters stake or the presiding or standing high council. Anyway, so then William Marks is one of these potential rivals, but he says the person who is the successor should be Sidney Rigdon by rights. So he kind of takes himself out of the running that way.
Okay, so as stake president, you're saying that he was a potential lead, but
it's not just stake president. So Brigham Young, in creating a bazillion stakes out in Utah, makes high councils and stakes a much smaller thing. And so it doesn't even make it any sense in the LDS thought process, I think, because I don't think there is a standing high council. They got rid of that. It's something that we have in our headquarters, right?
The standing high council, let's talk about that a little bit. So you've got 12 apostles, and then you've got 12 essentially high counselors that are at equal levels. Is that right?
They're equal.
What?
They're equal initially.
Equal, yeah.
With different areas of authority, as John said. Stake.
Yeah, because in the LDS church, it's the first presidency, the apostles, the 70s, and then the stake presidents. But in the early days of Nauvoo, what you're saying is the apostles, the Council of 12, were in charge of missionary work, and the standing high council was in charge of anywhere there were stakes.
Yeah, and headquarters, yeah.
And that's even Kirtland, and so it's horizontal, and it's the first presidency, the traveling high council, the standing high council, the 7 presidents of 70, all equal in authority. Oh,
because the 70 has essentially been demoted under Brigham Young now.
Right. So. And even in the original, and so this is the difference between that. So that's canon law, right? So that's what the DNC says. But then there's also de facto, which is to say, how is it actually functioning? And so what I've argued when I've done the research in this, so even though they're de facto all the same, obviously the first presidency de facto is, generally speaking, in charge. And so it gets to the top of the org chart. What I would say is that in the Missouri period, in far west, that functionally the High Council is then the next one. That was what I'd say. This is the Standing High Council because it has control of the purse strings. When the First Presidency want to have something funded, they go to the High Council as kind of like their legislatures, like going and passing things through Parliament, and essentially Parliament approves, and then they do things. So the High Council has a kind of an extraordinary amount of power, more so even I'd say than 12 in de facto in Missouri, and so that even one of the things that we do in the when we're telling the Mormon history narrative, Brigham Young emerges kind of in the Missouri period because they arrest all the important leaders and he's the most important person that didn't get arrested. And so then he leads the people, it's often told, out of Missouri back to Illinois. But when he does that, he doesn't do that as president of the 12. He has become the senior most member of the 12 because of Thomas Marsh has left the church and David W. Patton has gotten killed in the Battle of Crooked River. And so then he emerges as the senior most apostle. But in order to take control of the church, what he actually does is become acting president of the High Council. And so he convenes the High Council. He's the acting president of the High Council. He sees that as the leadership body in Missouri. And then the High Council actually replaces vacancies in the 12. And so that actually then is, kind of de facto saying that in Missouri, maybe the High Council had assumed a leadership, like a position above where the 12 was. Now, when you get to Nauvoo, that's changed. So that the power of the High Council atrophies in a de facto sense in Nauvoo. It's doing less and less and less important things. It's hearing appeals from stakes. Like Locke says, at a certain point, they dissolve a lot of the stakes outside of Nauvoo anyway, for various reasons. And so then, and they're just not as active anymore because now there's also a city council that has taken over a lot of these things. So the High Council does less and less. Meanwhile, over the course of the Nauvoo period, the 12 are doing more and more and more things. And so as a result of that, when we get to the 1844, in a de facto sense, it has gone the other way. The 12 probably are, in ascendant and are way more important than what the High Council has been. But in a canonical sense, they're equal.
Okay. So, and it's kind of confusing because you've got members who are apostles and members who are on the High Council, and they're the same people. Is that right? Because Brigham was an apostle and Brigham was also on the High Council?
Well, I'm saying he came in, when everybody got arrested, including a lot of the High Counselors, including Joseph Smith, they're all arrested for treason at the end of the Missouri Mormon War. Then Brigham Young was acting president of the High Council. I don't think that he continued to sit on the standing High Council.
So they're not usually the same people, but
because of the
crisis. It was a crisis.
Something that illustrates the point that John's making in a really clear way are the Kirtland Temple pulpits.
Yeah.
Who are their seats for? The High Council has seats. The traveling High Council does not, because they're not supposed to be there.
Yeah, if you see those pulpits that are describing, like the whole church's hierarchy, and you see deacons, teachers, priests, elders, bishops, High Council, First Presidency, where's apostles? So they aren't. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all from a modern LDS perspective.
Yeah, definitely. So that's interesting. Well, let's move on to some of the others.
Okay.
So we talked about Sidney Rigdon. No, this is
Rigdonites, and by the way, so even though his church atomized, there is an extant Rigdonite tradition church, and it's called the Church of Jesus Christ. It's headquartered in Monongahela, Pennsylvania. A lot of times, outsiders call them the Bickertonites. They don't particularly like that. But that's named after William Bickerton, who's an early leader of that church after Sidney Rigdon. And so that is in the Rigdon tradition, and it's sometimes seen as the third largest of the extant branches from 1844, with Brighamite being the largest, Josephite or Community of Christ RLDS tradition being the second largest, third largest being the Rigdonite or Bickertonite branch. And so they're a very interesting group. They're headquartered in Monongahela, Pennsylvania, and they have kind of like a kind of a Kirtland era church where they do feet washing. They're a little Pentecostal. They do everything by the Spirit. They don't write down the talks. You have to do it by the Spirit, just like praying by the Spirit, and other interesting things like that. They were the first Restoration Tradition church to have a black apostle back in the 1920s. So there's all kinds of things. Who's the Alice Cooper.
Oh, his dad.
I'm glad you answered that.
Alice Cooper. I'm trying to think of his one. Yeah. So Alice Cooper's grandfather is named, I don't remember what the Nephi or something like that. Nephi. Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. And so he was like one of the presidents or one of the apostles. I mean, his grandfather's like one of the apostles. And so he's not like an active member. He was like raised in the church. I don't think actually he was even baptized.
So you said they were a Pentecostal. Did they speak in tongues?
That's what I meant by Pentecostal. Yeah. I don't mean modern Pentecostal.
Not modern Pentecostal.
No, not a modern Pentecostal. But yes, they speak in tongues is what they do, but not like a modern Pentecostal church. I didn't mean it that way. But in that same way, at Pentecost in terms of speaking in tongues.
So would it, like a person moved upon by the Spirit, would they get up and start speaking just strange?
So I haven't actually been to a service where that. Have you been to one where they've done it?
I drove by but wasn't able to stop.
I went to a regional conference and it was really amazing. I don't remember, but nobody actually spoke in tongues during it. But it was the liveliest Latter-day Saint tradition service I have ever been to. Some tradition churches are kind of notoriously boring, within the tradition. But won't point fingers. But anyway, but this was the opposite of that because like at any given moment, the person who's presiding, would say, Brother Locke, do you feel like you want to come up and speak to us on tithing, and things like that. And so you'd come up and you give us, do you feel to do a musical number? I mean, literally, there's no program, and you don't ever know what's going to even end. And at a certain point, I'm like, what are they going to call me to do? I was thinking what I'm going to say. So it was a very active and lively. It was really great.
Wow. So I will tell you this. When I was in Independence, I think it was about 7 years ago, I went to the Stone Church, and that kind of reminded me a little bit of the Salt Lake Tabernacle because you've got the wooden pillars and everything. And that was a lot of fun. And then I went... at the end of that meeting, there's another church over kind of by the auditorium, more modern community of Christ.
That was, yeah. I think they've moved the Open Arms congregation. So yeah,
they had electric guitars and drums, and I was like, oh my gosh,
What is
this? Is weird. This is like Holy Roller Mormons or something. And then Jim Buncannon told me that a lot of times they have guitars at the Rock. At the Stone, is it called the Stone Church or the Rock Church? Stone Church. And I was like, oh, I've never seen.
Yeah, I've not experienced that, but
they do. I don't know, but different congregations have very different characters and traditions. It's kind of interesting when you go around to the different community. It's so as opposed to having a correlation, which has been the recent experience in the LDS Church, where everything is really standard plan, and it's actually point of pride that anywhere you go all around the planet, it's going to be the same. In the LDS Church, so that we have less to be proud of if that was what we were going for. But anyway, any congregation in Community of Christ is going to be remarkably different, and so it's always interesting for me to go and see. Oh, that's interesting how they do that. I mean, it actually, because we do it, what we do is very different in my congregation. So.
Yeah. So one other question I wanted to mention here, while we're talking a little bit about differences, is I understand the Community of Christ has both a pastor and a bishop. Can you? And you're currently serving as a pastor, isn't it?
Yes. So I'm pastor of the downtown Toronto congregation.
So what's the difference between a pastor and a bishop?
So the original leader of a congregation or a branch, they would be called branches in the early church, is called a pastor. And so if you go to the Articles of Faith, one of the offices that we believe in that are being restored includes pastors and evangelists. And you may be wondering, in some tradition, well, we don't seem to have pastors and evangelists. But evangelist was used in the early church as synonymously with patriarch. And so that is the same. And so in Community of Christ, we say evangelist, and it's the same general idea as in the LDS Church for patriarchs. But for pastor, what that is, it's the same equivalent as what you call branch president in the LDS Church, where presiding elder of a branch is also the pastor. So a bishop is originally a very different role in the early church. And so this is they had all these communitarian ideals, and they were trying to, let's say, make common stock companies. And so the idea is that when you would consecrate property to the church, then that would be the temporalities, property and stuff like that would be under the bishopric. And so the bishop, later becomes the presiding bishop of the church, is in charge of the property, and the other bishops are also in charge of the money part of it. So what ends up happening to change that in the LDS tradition is, in the whole course of the pioneer trek, where you really are having to really pool all of your resources, and the whole it becomes very intertwined, and all the money. And so then, as a result of just appointment of massive numbers of more bishops that Brigham Young does, then there's suddenly all these bishops, and the leaders of the different groups are bishops, and then they divide sections of territory up. Then you have to go to the church within your territory, which they use the civic term of ward. It's like a precinct of a it's a civil term that cities have. And so a ward area, a zone, then is run by a bishop in the LDS system, and that displaces the need for having a pastor. So in Community of Christ, you saw today in the worship service here in Salt Lake, there was a pastor and then there was a bishop. But there's not a bishop for every congregation or anything like that. So there just happened to be here a bishop. But essentially, each congregation will have a pastor. But then bishops are a financial officer, and they'll be more regional. So it's maybe a bigger role or bigger job.
Goes back to N.K. Whitney, Bishop of the Ohio Church, Edward Partridge, Bishop of the Missouri Church, so regional financial officer.
Yeah. Now, as I understand it, I thought that was pretty interesting. Hopefully I'm not misunderstanding that. The bishop and the pastor here in Salt Lake are a husband and wife team. Is that correct?
No.
Oh, I got that wrong.
Yeah.
No, the bishop is married to the guy who said the prayer in Ukrainian. That's her husband.
Oh, okay. So I did get that confused. I was like, well, that's kind of cool to have it. That's quite a team there. So I got that confused. Okay.
So there'll be so bishops don't correspond to congregations. So we don't have a bishop in my congregation.
Okay.
The closest bishop is there's a bishop in one of the suburban congregations.
Okay. And the bishop is in charge of the Aaronic priesthood.
So yeah, technically, that's what it was originally.
Really a financial officer, typically for a region.
Okay.
So in the pulpits, in the pulpit system in Kirtland Temple, the bishops are on the top of the Aaronic pulpit, and that's how it works. And functionally, so de facto now, we don't have our Aaronic priesthood to all go and meet with our bishop.
Presiding bishopric is over the Aaronic priesthood today. So yes, but really they're the chief financial officers for the mission center or stake or
region, regional area.
Okay.
So they're assigned to their region as opposed to.
Cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about James Strang. He was one of the. In fact, I think most Mormons would be pretty surprised to hear how influential he was as a leader in the early succession crisis. Can you talk a little bit about him? What was his background?
Yeah.
How did he begin?
So, of all of the different people that could have emerged, from in the succession crisis, this is the one that would be most unexpected to anybody before Joseph Smith's death, because he had been a relatively recent convert. He had only just he'd been to Nauvoo. Their Strangite recollections are that he had been baptized, by Joseph. He lived in Wisconsin. And so he wasn't an insider in any kind of significant way. But what happens fairly quickly is that he announces all sorts of new prophetic signs and callings and things like that, or examples. And so, for example, there's a new set of plates that are found with new set of official witnesses. There's new translation. He's calling people to gather to a new gathering place, a new stake. They're having a place for a temple. And there's all kinds of different things that make people feel that same, Mormonism of when you had a prophet, which they no longer did in Nauvoo, because one of the things that Brigham Young argued in beating down Sidney Rigdon's potential claim was, how can we possibly have a successor? The blood of the prophets is fresh here. There can't be, you no longer have a prophet in the flesh, but you have apostles who can lead the church. And so for Brigham Young and the 12 who are operating as in charge of the headquarters there at Nauvoo, they aren't doing anywhere near the kind of, let's say, leaning on the prophetic portions of the things that Joseph Smith was doing, like new revelations all the time and this kind of thing. And so for early members who, that's the kind of church that they joined up to be a part of, for many of them, they're attracted to Strang. And so he's a very interesting guy.
Yeah, well, yes. One of the first things, well, let's see, a few things that I'd like to talk about. There's a letter. He also translated some plates. Can you talk about those?
So he has a couple different ways he makes the claim. So for one thing, he says that he, at the same moment that Joseph Smith is killed, an angel appeared to him and ordained him to be prophet, seer, revelator, and translator to the church, so that there can only be one on the planet at a time. And so, there's not a thing that you can Joseph Smith can just give a bunch of keys to different people and then you recollect the keys or something like that. It's only can be one guy at a time. And that has to be, and it's not because you can't, if we ran out of, elders, in the LDS church, you can't have a deacon ordain some new elder. And so Strang says you can't have apostles ordain a prophet because that doesn't make any sense. You can't have the lower ordain. And so essentially the only way, according to Strang, that you could have had a successor is the same way that Joseph Smith became prophet, which is through angelic ordination. Or two, there is a verse in the Doctrine and Covenants that says, if Joseph Smith shall fall, he will not have any power save it be to appoint another in his stead. And so James Strang had a letter. His interpretation of the letter is that it's that it appointed him to be the successor of Joseph Smith's successor. It's a little bit ambiguously worded, so in that way, and then also, nobody who wasn't a Strangite believed the letter was genuine, right? So it's a contested letter, but he uses the letter also as a claim to that. Well, on the two fronts there, right? So there's angelic ordination on the one hand, and he's also been appointed the successor.
Yeah. So as I've read the letter, it seems to me like it was more of, well, you're going to lead the church in Wisconsin.
Right.
So it's a little bit vague as to what.
Yeah. And so it's a little strange because, okay, so it's hard to decide how you want to take it, because on the one hand, if it's the forgery, like everybody would like to say on the one hand, why wouldn't he forge it?
Why wouldn't he be really clear?
Yeah, why wouldn't you forge it? So for sure he's the successor. On the other hand, there's all kinds of problems with it in terms. It's certainly not written in Joseph Smith's hand. Joseph Smith had scribes. Anyway, so possibly the letter is a little ambiguous, but certainly that was one of his claims.
Well, supposedly the letter was signed by Joseph Smith, though. It was written by another person and signed by Joseph. Is that right?
But I don't think that I don't think that it's Joseph Smith's signature either. So anyway, I don't know. I'm not a handwriting expert. So you can interview Robin Jensen at the LDS Church History Department. You can get his take on it, because he studied that.
Oh, okay. Okay. So he also has some plates. I think there's the Book of the Law of the Lord, and then yesterday you talked about the Vori plates. So
yes.
Let's talk about those.
So the first set of plates are the Vori plates.
Oh, that was the first set.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So the first set of plates that Strang announces are the Vori plates, and it's just a very interesting story, but I could talk about it for hours and hours. But anyway, the idea of it is that near Strang's house in Burlington, Wisconsin, in a place that becomes to be known as Vori, there's a hill. An angel in a vision, Strang says, told him where plates were buried. He brings 4 guys to that spot. He shows them where the angel told him. They have shovels or whatever, and then Strang leaves. So they dig up the where they told them to. They believe that the earth has never been disturbed ever, and that they have to actually go get under the roots of this big old tree and things like that. And so they're convinced that the thing had been buried there many, many years ago, before this oak tree was on top of it, and that kind of thing. Anyway, so they dig up plates. They're plates, though, that people physically see, and it's not simply the official witnesses who physically see them. Thousands of people see the plates, including obviously lots of non-members, including the local newspaper man, who's the newspaper editor of the Kenosha newspaper, and he actually goes on to be the guy that invents the QWERTY typewriter keyboard. Anyway, so that guy, saw him. He decided he didn't pass judgment on him or whatever. He says some people think they're pretty marvelous, and but whatever, so he wasn't too. But anyway, the point is, it's a physical artifact, and so Strang prints a translation of it. So through the gift and power of God. He says that he is able to translate these plates, and the gist of the translation is that it's a people that are killed out, it's like just like the Nephites. Doesn't say Nephites, but anyway, it's a native people that have died in a great battle at this spot again. But the spot is going to be a place of refuge. That at some point or other, the church of the people, the God's people are going to the forerunner, essentially the first prophet, Joseph Smith, doesn't say it in names, but anyway, I'm just going to read between the lines here. Joseph Smith is going to get executed, and the people are going to have to flee. The first refuge, and so they'll come to Vori. They'll gather to Vori, where a great successor is going to emerge.
So it sounds like a prophecy about what happens in Nauvoo, and then they
and it prophesies essentially Strang's leadership, and so that is printed as part of pamphlets and stuff like that. So circulars that the Strangite missionaries then go and send around. And so this is one of the sets of these prophetic claims that just seem really like Joseph Smith and that really convince, for a time anyway, lots and lots of the early members, and so people can be quickly convinced by Strang, and they'll hang out with him for a little while, and then a lot of times they'll become disillusioned for this or that reason. One of the things that's always been problematic for all of the what we might call non-mainline groups, the people who aren't Brigham Young having control of the headquarters. So all the other people are kind of trying to gather together dissenters, or people who are opposed to Brigham Young's leadership for any number of reasons. And so when your whole thing is, the loyalists are all committed to one thing and they're all on the same page as each other, the people who aren't on that page are not all on the same page with each other, right? And so for the rest of all of the traditions, they all have to deal with the fact that you're hurting all the cats that have already fled the coop, and so how do you get them all together? And so Strang has to deal with that, but he does a pretty good job of it. So through the course of his career, he's ultimately himself martyred. So in 1856, he's killed.
And so can you talk a little bit more about that? What were the events that happened there?
So at a certain point, Vori has the same problem that Kirtland had, which is it's already been settled. So when you try to build Zion in a place that's already established, you can't afford the property because the farms are already built up, and you have to buy them, and all the people are poor. And so Zion works best when you can go out to the frontier and you get free land from the government or from the Indians, like Brigham Young ultimately did, or like they were doing in far west Missouri, where you're out there and you can just expropriate or get all of the land. And so then it really is able to build pretty fast. Nauvoo's kind of a hybrid where it had been a little unsettled, but anyway, it was, I think, a big mistake for them to go back. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Anyway, so James Strang, Vori's kind of like that. So then he's looking for a new place to go, and so he has a vision, and he goes. They're led to the Beaver Islands, which are the largest islands in Lake Michigan, and they're up. I lived in Michigan long enough that I can do this, but anyway, that's how everybody in Michigan does, and so they're right here in between the two. So, Anyway, and so they're up there, and so they have a very thriving colony that they're ultimately able to build on Beaver Island. When they first get there, they say, well, don't even bother to come here unless you could bring all these supplies and this and that. By the time they're really established there, they say anybody who comes will be able to, even if they just get off the boat, they'll be able to, by cutting down wood and selling the wood to the steamships that come by beginning to do the different agricultural things and other kind of industry that they had. It was they can just make themselves, make a profession for themselves. So it's a well-established colony with maybe a couple thousand members on the island, but then Strang and the Mormons got in conflict with their neighbors. That's a very normal thing, and so they block voted. Strang got to be the representative. He was, the representative in the Michigan State Legislature, especially over a lot of people that didn't want him to be. They just are in conflict with the people on the other island, so Mackinac Island, which is the earlier settled zone. So they're having rivalry with each other. Eventually, in collusion probably with the U.S. Navy, some former dissenters, some Mackinac Islanders, and the Navy go, and the ship sails up to Beaver Island. Strang, who is way less paranoid and should be more paranoid, but way less paranoid than Joseph by the end, where Joseph has all these bodyguards and things like that. Strang just walks right down the dock to see what the ship wants and this kind of thing, and the brazen conspirators just shoot him. And then and they get back on the ship, and the Navy ferries them away back to the enemy island Mackinac, where they have where they're all acquitted of everything. So anyway, so then the Strangites face it's pretty terrible. So then the way worse than and almost the worst that Mormons ever have faced whenever they got kicked out of anywhere. So on the one hand, their prophet's mortally wounded and dies. Next, the Gentiles all come. They round everybody up on the island at gunpoint. They say, you have 5 minutes or whatever. Bring all your property down to the dock. Everybody collects whatever they can gather. They come to the dock. When they get to the dock, they're separated from their property. They're brought onto different steamboats. The steamboats then drop them off all around the edges of Lake Michigan in little tiny groups, so they completely destitute and penniless, so they can't regather. And so anyway, it's just a horrible thing that the Strangite Mormons had to go through.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times we think about at least in the LDS Church, we talk about persecution of the mountain saints, but the Strangites really had some pretty serious persecutions as well.
Yeah. And so they are eventually able to regather. They have been small, the ones that stayed in the Strangite faith. Most Strangites ultimately probably who stayed in the movement joined into the reorganization and became members of what's now Community of Christ, or other RLDS tradition churches, Josephite churches. But a small group stayed, small but sustainable group stayed, and they still have a functioning congregation back in Voree. Great group of people. So I'd love to go visit them.
Yeah, I'd love to visit them too sometime. All right, it seems like two other issues that the Strangites had were, it seemed like something to do with word of wisdom and something to do with polygamy.
Well, so Strang initially is an outsider, and so he initially believes the kind of church headquarters published rhetoric. So the complexity of Joseph Smith and church leaders in Nauvoo is that from the pulpit they're denouncing polygamy. They don't, they're opposed to polygamy, and they're publishing that and they're saying that. But the way they're doing it is they're doing that as this kind of code phrase way of doing it. We're opposed to polygamy in brackets, which is the God, the devil's counterfeit for the actual God's true principle of celestial marriage, plural marriage. And anyway, so he isn't originally an insider, and so Strang is actually a very articulate opponent of polygamy, and that's one of the things he's beating up the 12 and the Brighamite branch over. Over time, so many insiders, Nauvoo insiders, have gathered together to Strang. I think that he may well have been convinced by them that this really was what the church had been doing. That's possibly where he's getting it. That's not how he claims it. Strang's way he describes the story is as he is translating a separate set of plates, the brass plates, the plates of Laban, as described in the Book of Mormon. He gets a hold of those. When he is translating those and producing the fourth book of Strangite scripture, the Book of the Law of the Lord, he's apparently shocked to find out that polygamy is actually God's law. And so he and other Strangites and Beaver Island are practicing polygamy openly. So he has four plural wives that he's living with at the time of his martyrdom. So polygamy is one. What was the other one?
Wasn't there an alcohol issue as well?
Well, so the alcohol issue is that there's this issue that with temperance, where early Latter-day Saints are interested in promoting temperance, and they're living on the frontier, and on the frontier, all the people are doing on the frontier is drinking whiskey, and so for the Mackinac Islanders, one of their sources of income is to sell whiskey to Native Americans who have money because of Indian agents, so when they get their allotment and things like that, the money's there. The money can then be spent on whiskey from these Indian traders or whatever, and so they're making a big living on getting the Indians' money out of them, and anyway, abusing the situation here. And so Strang is absolutely opposed to that and is making that illegal. So he makes that practice illegal, and that makes everybody at Mackinac Island very upset.
So because he's against alcohol and
he's against selling it to the Indians and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of a nice segue. This morning I attended your Sunday school class, and that was one of probably the most interesting Sunday school class on the word of wisdom. I know yesterday when he told me he was going to speak on the word of wisdom, I was like, oh, not again.
So that's kind of funny because we don't have very many Word of Wisdom Sunday school classes.
No, that's the first time I'd ever been to one, but it was really interesting.
So, to be honest, I just love the kind of the historical aspect. Do you have a background in history? I should ask that.
I do not. So I'm passionate. I'm an amateur. Russian studies and economics is my background.
Okay.
But I fell in love with Latter-day Saint history, sitting at the feet of Alma Blair in a museum management internship in Nauvoo in 1991. And I've been doing history ever since, but I have no credentials.
Oh, wow. So anyway, could you tell us a little bit about the history of the word of wisdom? As I understand it in the LDS Doctrine and Covenants, section 89, and today I found it at section 86 in your Doctrine and Covenants. But you just gave some really interesting stuff that I had not heard about, especially with strong drink. Maybe we'll talk about that, especially since we were just talking about alcohol.
Sure. So as I started to dig into trying to understand the cultural context of the word of wisdom, how did they understand it? What do these words mean to them? It wasn't hard to find good source material, much of it gathered by Latter-day Saint researchers, including there's a BYU thesis by Peterson in the 1960s that does a really good job of setting the word of wisdom in context. And that and other materials helped me understand that they're using language in the word of wisdom that we have different definitions for today. So for example, strong drink, which I always assumed meant alcohol, it's abundantly clear that meant distilled spirits, very particularly distilled spirits. And the word of wisdom then talks about wine.
Now, let me back up a little bit because I am not an alcohol aficionado, but you mean more like whiskey.
Whiskey is distilled, rum is distilled, wine is not distilled, beer is not distilled.
Okay.
Wine, according to the word of wisdom, is for your sacrament offerings. It's the only time you're supposed to drink wine, according to the word of wisdom. And they used red currant wine at the Kirtland Temple dedication, courtesy of the Whitney family. And they seem to interpret sacrament to mean not only the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, but a broader understanding, which included, at times anyway, marriages or weddings. So it would be not uncommon at Latter-day Saint weddings to have afterwards wine and cake. And then, of course, mild barley drinks are good for the body, which was beer. Not a high alcohol content, but it was beer. And so when you start digging into the daily lives of the people, they're drinking wine, they're drinking beer, but they're doing it in moderation. And Joseph was a huge fan of temperance, which again, I always thought meant prohibition. That's not what it meant. It's moderation. It's the opposite of gluttony or overindulgence. And so I now realize when I read accounts of people getting in trouble for not following the word of wisdom, it's not that they had a glass of beer. It's that they were overindulging or drinking strong drink, whiskey, probably struggling maybe with alcoholism, for example. So it was a kind of a new understanding for me, and I think for many people, but it's not new in our history community. We just haven't thought about those things for several decades now. And in the RLDS/Community of Christ tradition, typically we have been in a place where we have strongly encouraged moderation and discouraged addiction. And that has been kind of the standard that we've encouraged our members to avoid addiction and encouraged moderation. And at times we had different understandings for members versus priesthood members versus leaders. And at times we haven't. So it's been fun kind of untangling all that.
Yeah. Well, there's a verse in the Doctrine and Covenants that talked about alcohol for the washing of your bodies. I've never, ever understood that before. Although I will say that I did read, I think it's David Berger's book, Mysteries of Godliness, where he talks a little bit about how alcohol was used in temple ceremonies.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah, Greg Prince does a nice job as well in his Power from on High. So, and this is really Prince's work, but he talks about the development of the concept of endowment. There's 4 periods during Joseph's lifetime, and they're initially turning to Luke and Acts, where Jesus tells his disciples, to tarry in Jerusalem until they're endowed with power from on high. Joseph restates that as section 38 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And instead of tarry in Jerusalem, it's go to the Ohio, and there you will be endowed with power from on high. So this idea of coming together to be empowered by the Holy Spirit for missionary outreach, and they fairly quickly, even though it's not in section 38 or in Luke or in Acts, they add an ordinance. And so at the Isaac Morley Farm in 1831, that is ordination to high priesthood, the first time that Melchizedek priesthood is introduced to the church. The second endowment period is the N.K. Whitney store and the opening of the School of the Prophets. The ordinance is feet washing under the direction of the presidency. But you get to Kirtland Temple and it expands a little bit. So they would do a ritual cleansing outside the temple in the schoolhouse behind the temple, or sometimes in Joseph's home. So with cinnamon whiskey and perfume water, ritual cleansing, put on clean clothes, go to the third floor of the temple, anoint the head with oil, sealing or confirming blessing of that anointing, and then some feet washing downstairs. That took weeks, so it's not that something you do in an afternoon. And they spent months or years in preparation for that, but the process took weeks. And through that process, they understood that they were then empowered by the Holy Spirit and could go into the world. And we wouldn't allow our missionaries to go overseas until they had been endowed with power. So even 1839, most of the members have left Kirtland. There are new missionaries who were not there in the 1830s. Joseph had them detour through Kirtland. Theodore Turley, John Taylor among them, Brigham Young goes with, so that they can be empowered by the Holy Spirit, and only then could they sail to the United Kingdom.
Oh, wow. Now, you also had mentioned, they didn't bathe every day like you should now.
Yeah, and so I think that the cinnamon whiskey would have both, would cleanse, it would sterilize, make them smell better. So it was purification, physically, spiritually, in every way, in preparation to go to the temple.
So somebody, I think, had asked a question about this being the word of wisdom being a sort of a temple text. And so these rituals, I guess what I understand with the Kirtland Temple, going back to Kirtland, they did do some sort of a washing ordinance. Was that with this whiskey, or do you know, was that in the temple, or was that just in the N.K. Whitney store? Or?
So the washing ordinance with whiskey was in the schoolhouse behind the temple, or in Joseph's home, just prior to going into the temple. Now, I also wonder, though, if the temple text reference wasn't to some of the other language that maybe makes it into temple ritual later. So that
could you expand on that a little bit?
I'm not sure that I don't want to offend anybody, so I'm not. John, do you want to expand on that?
I haven't met. So I mean, in other words, I pretty deliberately. So I mean, I was raised LDS, an adult convert to Community of Christ, but I didn't ever go as an adult. I never went to. I wasn't a missionary, and I never went through the temple and had endowment or anything like that. And I've just kind of had it as I know the kind of particulars in terms of having read some of the historical development from the Masonry and things like that, but I haven't done the thing where I, go through the transcripts or watch the YouTube videos and things like that, because it's sacred for a lot of people I know and family and friends and things like that. So I don't actually know the details of it. So.
Okay. There's another reference that I wanted to mention, which I was going to ask this in the class today, but I didn't. The reference to tobacco. It says it's for all sick cattle. Tom Kimball was nice enough to send me a copy of Mormonism Unveiled, the first anti-Mormon book ever, that Dan Vogel just recently put some awesome footnotes in there. And I do remember E.D. Howe, who was definitely an anti-Mormon, a little bit over the top. It was kind of interesting to read that book. But one of the things that he kind of made fun of was the word of wisdom. And he says, well, if you're supposed to use this for sick cattle, what are you doing? He didn't prescribe that very well. Do you have any idea what that reference was?
So I just was having a discussion with somebody who was explaining that often it would be used for poultices. Maybe that's the bruise part of the tobacco more than anything. With the cattle part, this might be highly speculative, but it's one of the things I want to track down. I was at a towpath on a canal in New Hope, Pennsylvania, not long ago, reading an interpretive panel, and it talked about how the mules, as they got tired, would be given tobacco to kind of
Like to chew.
to eat, to kind of pep them up and get them going again, give them the energy to keep going. And I thought, I think I need to start paying a little more attention to that. So that's one of the things I hope to continue with the research, is to make better sense of the tobacco for cattle and how was it used with animals at the time. But I do think the bruising part is probably a reference to poultices. So I have met people who had tobacco poultices applied to them.
Kind of like just a bandage sort of a thing?
Yeah, to just on a wound, and it would draw out. So there's a lot more work to do.
And then you also mentioned something about eating meat sparingly. I think you said some people wouldn't eat meat between Easter and Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I know Community of Christ members, this would not be typical at all, but I do know members who wouldn't eat meat between Easter and Thanksgiving, which meant that whenever I visited, there was tuna noodle casserole because they didn't consider fish meat.
Right.
And we do a lot of camps in Community of Christ, both as youth camps and family camps. And my greatest fear as a kid was having a Word of Wisdom cook. So not much meat, lots of whole grains, lots of fruits and vegetables. Now I spend a lot of time at camps still, but my greatest fear is that we won't have a Word of Wisdom cook.
Too many hot dogs and hamburgers.
Yeah.
That's funny. I'm trying to remember if there was anything else along those lines. Is there anything else you wanted to add on the Word of Wisdom there?
I just was really surprised at how different their understanding was than our understanding today of their understanding and of the document. And so it just reminds us the importance of context. And I was intrigued at how active the temperance movement was in the country at the time, in the state of Ohio, and even right there in Kirtland. And so, so often Revelation is a response to questions or things happening around us. So to run into those references where people are going to the distillery in Kirtland, getting drunk and falling down and freezing to death, you understand why Joseph would be asking these questions. It makes more sense in the context.
Mm-hmm. But do you guys have any last things you want to share with the audience? You can think of this.
We've been all over the place. I don't know. There's more rights. So that's hardly an exhaustive, group. So I didn't mean to be leaving anybody out.
Yeah, actually, there were a few. I'm glad you mentioned that because we've covered Rigdon, we've covered Strang, we've covered why the Brighamites dissolved the first presidency. I thought that was very interesting. Who were some of the other? I think Lyman White had a.
Yeah, so we mentioned the Hedrickites, and so I mentioned how they came. They had the Temple Lot group.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Granville. So how did he start off with that?
Well, like I say, they were like a branch that So one of the things that happened. It's hard for us to think about it because we think of all of the churches now as being a very discrete legal entity, and everything is way more real because it's all legal and has property and all the kind of things. You didn't immediately in 1844 have, like a fully cloned legal bodies or something like that. The church didn't actually have church buildings largely. I mean, the Kirtland Temple is the first building that they built, right, in terms of for place of worship. So it's not like there was like little chapels all over the place and it's who like you owning the chapel or something like that. But there are branches that are spread all throughout the Midwest and the East, especially in Britain, and so for a lot of these branches, they're just operating, with their local pastor and their local members, and they don't have it's not the building, they're meeting in a cottage meeting, they're meeting in somebody's house, and the way they are interacting, then they don't have. You can't go to the website. You can't, watching on satellite or whatever, however it all works now, and when you're watching LDS General Conference or something like that. So instead, what they have is the newspaper, so the Times and Seasons, and then they have missionaries and people who are traveling all around it. So they'll go and hit all the different branches. And so when you have a schism, and then there's suddenly two headquarters, it's not that the branch changed much at all. What's different is now sometimes people come from the other headquarters with a newspaper. And so those missionaries, and you might know them, they might be your cousins, so you might have a branch where at a certain point, you've heard that Joseph Smith is killed. You're very sad. Brighamite missionaries come through. They say the 12 are now in charge and things like that. And everyone's like, hey, now we got it. We read about that in the newspaper and this kind of thing. And then, a couple of months later, somebody from Voree comes with the Voree Herald, and they explain about how the 12 are in apostasy and why, this and that and why, and all the prophetic gifts that have proved that Strang is the successor. And they're like, oh, well, we're Strangites now. And so, and there isn't anything in particular that necessarily happens, for the branch. And so, like I say, for the Hedrickites, there are 5 maybe of these branches that are kind of in a cluster around Bloomington, Illinois. I think probably at some point or other, they will have been affiliated with Strang, but at a certain point, maybe when he, affiliated, whatever it even means, right? So Strangite missionaries will come through there, and that's one of the reasons why maybe they didn't gather and go west. But at some point or other, probably over polygamy, when Strang goes from being opponent of polygamy to a proponent of polygamy openly, they probably broke with him. And then at a certain point, they are meeting with the emerging reorganization and deciding whether they're going to affiliate with the reorganization. And in fact, Granville Hedrick is even assigned by a reorganization conference to write a pamphlet about something. Do you remember? Anyway, he's assigned to write a pamphlet. He writes the pamphlet, and they don't all like each other with what results. Ultimately, they decide not to affiliate. And so his group then decides that it reorganizes itself, and it's the church. And they have, as I mentioned, they had John E. Page, who was one of the apostles or from before Joseph Smith's death, and he, is granting a certain amount of legitimacy. And so once they get, their reorganization going, then that gives them, they ask for revelation and new purposes. And so one of the things that they focus around is they need to go back and redeem Zion. They need to go back to, Jackson County. The end times are coming. This is where the New Jerusalem's going to be. They need to redeem the temple lot, and they go and do that. So they go and move.
So Granville does that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how is there because it sounds like he was kind of part of the reorganized church, but it seems like there was
no, they were considering affiliating, right? So they're all branches. So all these branches in Wisconsin, and ultimately Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, they're sitting around. They don't want to have any of the headquarters at a certain point because the headquarters leaders have come out and said, well, we're practicing polygamy openly. So they're no longer interested in Strang's leadership off on Beaver Island. They're not interested in Brigham Young's leadership off in Salt Lake. Sidney Rigdon's church is in general collapsed. And so then at a certain point, how are we going to bring this all back together? And so and this is the origin of the reorganization. So the branches start to, they pray about it. They fall back on individual personal revelations for the individual congregations, the pastors. They start meeting together. They as they're thinking about it, I mean, William Smith has had a church in the meantime, and William Smith has been promoting the idea of lineal succession. And there has been, I think I mentioned a while ago anyway, there's this sense that Joseph Smith's posterity, one of his sons is going to be the successor or emerge as a successor. They start to regather these branches, and they form kind of a conference organization, which is not it's a loose structure, right? There's no corporate entity here still. And so they pass resolutions together in conferences where they say that they're going to wait for one of Joseph Smith's sons, probably Joseph III, to emerge to receive the prophetic calling, and to accept that mantle. And so when that happens in 1860, and he comes to a conference of the new organization, what becomes the reorganization, what becomes Community of Christ, then that becomes something that all these little branches start to get really excited about. And so fairly quickly, then that reorganization draws from all of the different tradition churches, including people who'd gone west, who were dissatisfied with what was going on under Brigham Young and in Utah. Many of those people, they had been farmers. They had just been living this wonderful area of Iowa they come into this wonderful desert that we are here, and some of them think, hey, maybe I should go back to Iowa, and a lot of them did, or some of them got called to go to San Bernardino at some point or other. They built this wonderful city, and then at a certain point, Brigham Young's like, yeah, you're not allowed to stay in San Bernardino. And so it turns out then a couple RLDS missionaries show up a little bit after that, and then all those guys become RLDS, so San Bernardino becomes a big center of the reorganization. So that kind of thing. So all of these different, again, the centers from the different groups, as the different groups collapse, they all start to say, hey, here's this guy, he's the son, he looks just like his father, it's reminding me of the old Mormonism, he's the prophet. And so that's how the Josephite tradition then, which means Joseph III, the Josephite tradition that becomes Community of Christ emerges. But at that point, the Hedrickites, who had never really fully affiliated, they're on their own thing. They decided they didn't go that way. They weren't going to sit around and wait for Joseph III.
So it's not like Granville became a new prophet or anything. He was just kind of a branch president, for lack of a better word.
So he received some revelations, and I think that he was. I think that at a time they did reorganize their church, and he's the president of the church. And I think that they may have even initially. I'm not remembering the details of it, but I think they may have actually had apostles. But then that their structure breaks down by the time. By the 1920s anyway, but then it comes back. So yes, now they have apostles again. So it's too complicated a story. So they do. So they are, so the Hedrickites and the Bickertonites are the two churches that are very influenced by David Whitmer and the Whitmerites, who are now extinct. So that group also continued to exist. David Whitmer organizes a church, and it's a very interesting one, but it's extinct, so we can't spend too much time on it. But anyway, one of the things that he did was he pointed out all kinds of later changes in the church, that he felt were wrong. So he wrote several, an address to all believers in the Book of Mormon, an address to all believers in Christ. It's quite influential. And so it talks about things like the first presidency and that as being completely not scriptural and that are a sign of apostasy. And so the Bickertonites and the Hedrickites don't have first presidencies. They have 12 apostles, and the 12 apostles lead their churches.
Oh, wow. And I believe the Bickertonites don't believe in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah, both of them don't believe in the Doctrine and Covenants too. So in other words, all of the changes and the revelations from the original dictation to then the Book of Commandments to the Doctrine and Covenants, they're heavily edited. That to them convinces the Hedrickites and the Bickertonites that means that they're bogus. And so the D&C is not part of their canon. And you can even go to the Temple Lot Church and they'll actually have pamphlets on the changes to it and why the D&C is a fraud for that from their perspective.
And even the Book of Commandments. Well, I guess that didn't really exist. The problem was it was scattered. Right?
Yeah. Well, I don't. Yeah. Anyway, the Book of Commandments there hadn't been very many copies of it, so that would be something they'd have to reabsorb and make new. They mostly use the Book of Commandments, I think, as a way to discredit the Doctrine and Covenants.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay. So Lyman White, could you talk about his group?
So Lyman White was a leader who was really important early on. So he's general of Zion's camp. He's one of the heads of the leadership in the Adamanayamon area in the West. And it's just because I think because of happenstance that he wasn't actually in the 12 originally, and he's only a later replacement of the 12. But I think in his mind, he's older than Brigham Young, and I think in his mind he seriously outranks Brigham Young in terms of his Mormon cred.
Well, and that's interesting because the original 12 apostles were assigned by age, right? So I guess Brigham was the third oldest in the original quorum.
Right, by a week, right? So if Heber Kimball had been born a week earlier, then life would have been pretty different. So Lyman must have joined the quorum later, and so he joins as a replacement because he stays in Missouri after Zion's camp, and so he's like the leader out, or one of the leaders anyway out there. But anyway, he could have, if he'd come back, he could have been one of the people that had gotten picked because he'd been the general of the camp, and if that had happened, he was older, and then the apostles, which became more important later. Anyway, so he had a lot of early jobs that were more important than anything Brigham Young was doing, and I'm sure he probably resented that. Anyway, he had also had a calling within the Council of 50, which was also organized by age. And so again, he was fairly senior by being an older guy, and he believed that he was call to bring people to relocate to Texas. So the Council of 50 was working on all kinds of different potential relocation ideas, but moving to the Republic of Texas, which was a not particularly, it was claiming independence anyway. It was claiming to be an independent republic. Later, the United States, in annexing it, recognized that claim as being legitimate. But the Republic of Texas was working, actually had received Mormon ambassadors from the Council of 50 and was prepared to give a whole huge tract of land that it didn't actually own, but it was claiming between Mexico and itself in order to have create maybe a Mormon buffer state between Texas and Mexico. And so Lyman White didn't like the change from that plan. So as far as he was concerned, that was the marching orders that Joseph Smith had before death, and he didn't need to be told anything different by somebody like Brigham Young. So, and Brigham Young also didn't challenge him in that way. He just told him he can't recruit any new people. So he was just able to take his people. So he gathered up all the people from the pioneers in Wisconsin, and he took them all to Texas, and he formed a very successful colony down there. And so the Whiteite Church was a pretty successful gathering for a while, but they had a couple setbacks because of floods and other kinds of things. And Lyman White at a certain point dies. He never claimed to be the successor, and he in fact recognized he was one of the people who had been around for some of these special blessings where Joseph Smith declared that Joseph III would be the prophet of the church, and Lyman White really believed that. And so most of the Whiteites that stayed in the tradition actually became RLDS then, or Community of Christ, even though they had been living a kind of high Nauvoo theology, polygamy practice, kind of Mormonism, which they then kind of gave up as they entered into the reorganization. So that's extinct, the Whiteites. So they're gone.
There you go. Okay. Are there any other groups
that we missed that are around? So the Cutlerites,
oh yes,
are around.
Yes.
So and the Cutlerites are down to just a handful of people, but they're very, very interesting. So the Cutlerites, Alphaeus Cutler had been one of the Masons of the Nauvoo Temple. He's an older guy, so he'd also been one of the senior members of the Council of 50. He was one of the leaders of the pioneer trek under the 12 across to winter quarters, and there's a part of winter quarters that's called the Cutler's Camp. He himself he felt a special calling from the Council of 50 to do a Lamanite mission, so to go talk to the Indians. And so at a certain point, again, he was one of the guys who felt that the successor should be Joseph III. So in winter quarters, when Brigham Young in 1847 reorganizes a first presidency and makes himself be the president of his faction of the church, when that happens, Cutler kind of begins to break. He decides he's not going west. He kind of is setting his own course. His personal belief is the end times are about to happen, and if he's going to stay right there in Omaha, Nebraska, or in Council Bluffs, Iowa, then he just has to, sail down the river, and then you're to Jackson County, Missouri, and he doesn't have to. Why would he have to go across the mountains and come back? And so he doesn't. And so instead, they found a colony called Manti, Iowa, and several little Cutlerite colonies. But again, at kind of a pivotal moment, Cutler is aged, and kind of infirm, and he'd also kind of said that maybe that Joseph III was going to be the successor. So when the missionaries of the reorganization make it to Manti, pretty much all the Cutlerites join the reorganization, including all of Cutler's descendants. But some Cutlerites don't agree, and they kind of have a vision that they will find refuge away from all of these reorganites up in Minnesota. And so they go up to Clitheroe, Minnesota, where they make a Cutlerite colony, and then the RLDS missionaries find them. and so they convert about half of them up there. And so then at a certain point, they decide that they need to go back to redeem Zion. And so they go there. Anyway, so at a certain point, almost all the Cutlerites that ended up staying in the tradition ended up being in the reorganization tradition. But a small loyal group to that tradition, to the Cutler tradition, are having they have their own church in Independence, and there's maybe 6 members, probably. I don't know, it's about 6. It's pretty small, so it's the one that is, in the most danger of extinction as a result. I often joke that there's 20 anthropologists that are camped out around the Cutlerites. There's more people trying to study the Cutlerites than Cutlerites themselves, and in part it's because they're the only one of these these groups that we've been talking about, other than the Brighamites, who because the Whiteites are extinct. So the only other one that is got some kind of a Nauvoo era endowment ceremony, and theirs is much longer. It's a secret. It's sacred, but it's secret, and they won't tell about it. So in other words, there's too many Mormons, Brighamite Mormons, to not give away the secret. So in other words, the secret's out here, but the Cutlerites have been way more mum, and so as a result, everybody wants to know, what it's like, because it would be another version that has come separately, a separate transmission line from Nauvoo, right? And so people are just, and people love secrets, right? So anyway, so as a result, everyone loves studying the Cutlerites.
And aren't they just down the road?
Yeah.
From the
temple.
The temple, yeah. So, as I recall, I remember Tom Kimball said something about when the MHA was there 7 years ago or so, that they were so excited because they'd had more people in their church than, in years.
Yeah.
They're so small now.
Yeah.
So, and I wish we could talk a little bit more about that, but I guess there's not much to know because they're pretty mum about their temple.
Well, there's not much to know about that part of it, but there's all kinds of other things they're doing. So again, they, other early tradition stuff that's important to them are things like, United Order things. And so they have a whole bunch of church-owned property there, and they own things in common, they share in common, they're living in church houses together. So there's things like that they're doing that they've maintained that are different from some of the other churches.
Okay, and are these 6 people just really aged now? So there's probably not.
It's like many of them are very. It's like if I'm going to use my number 6 that I gave, 3 of them are really old. One is a woman who's older middle age, and then she has 2 sons that are like in 30 or something like that. I don't know. I don't know. Steve Shields would be able to tell you this because he has the direct contact with them. But I'm just trying to remember from the last time I said, but it's somewhere like that where there's 2 younger sons, I think. And so the idea is, depending on how committed they are to the tradition, is how well that the tradition is sustainable, right? And so if they you could become their calling, and then they would be able to, they get married and who knows what could happen.
Or they could end up like the Shakers and pretty much stay out.
That's right. So, or the Whitmerites only died out in the early 1960s. So that was another entire tradition that had continued on, but it's gone now.
Huh. All right. All right. One last question about the Kirtland Temple. Do you know approximately when it changed from this bluish granite-looking building to the white?
Yeah, what happened to the color of the temple? So it would have faded probably relatively quickly from the blue-gray, and then the walls have no footings under them. They just start at 2 feet and away they go, and there's no expansion joints in them, which means that they would have been moving from pretty early, so lots of cracks. So we began patching the stucco extensively in the 1880s, probably even earlier, into the early 19th or 20th century. And it's really hard to match perfectly the color. So for the longest time, it was kind of multicolored, different shades of off-white and light gray. We removed the remaining stucco in the 1950s and replaced it. And then the sandstone around the windows and the doors has iron in it, and it rusts. So you get rust streaks that start developing on the building. So in the 1960s, we start painting to cover the rust streak. So it's probably only been that brilliant white since the 1960s.
Oh, really? It was kind of grayish white before.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great. Well, I really appreciate you guys. John came all the way from Toronto, and you were all the way from Nauvoo. I might have to hit you on some Nauvoo history. Another
Please do.
Well, great. And John, I'm going to try to get you as much as I can. You're one of my favorite historians. All right. Well, thank you guys for participating here on Gospel Tangents, and I'll let you guys go.
It's been a joy. Thanks.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.